Hello and welcome to your Newsmax Daily for Tuesday, July 8th, 2025, 7/8/25 digitally, the 189th day of the year and day 5 of search and rescue operations in Central Texas, where the death toll has now topped 100. 104 people have been killed in the flooding. Let that sink in for a moment. 104 people, including many children and young adults. Yet the majority of the news coverage and dialogue has been all around President Trump's DOJ cuts. I've heard nothing about the victims. I've heard very little empathy, very little sympathy, or even tales of survival for that matter. It's absolutely unacceptable. It's disgusting, frankly.
Blaming President Trump for these floods is a depraved lie, and it serves no purpose during this time of national mourning.
White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who also said President Trump will be going to Texas as soon as possible.
The White House is currently arranging those travel plans. We hope that it will be later this week, likely on Friday, but of course we want to do it at the most appropriate time on the ground for state and local officials. We don't want to interrupt the recovery efforts.
We have a lot of ground to cover here, but I'm starting with my buddy Rob Finnerty, who shares my sentiments exactly.
We don't know how these parents are doing what they're doing right now. 850 people have been rescued. 104 have been killed. Dozens are missing. And that number is only expected to go up, the number that have been killed. And tonight, at least 27 Camp Mystic campers and counselors are gone, with many still missing. Little girls, 8 years old, girls who were dropped off by their parents last Monday for a summer of canoeing and horseback riding, arts and crafts and pottery and swimming and baking and theater and sports, everything you do at camp. But that dream has turned into a nightmare for so many little girls. I have an 8-year-old little girl, and she is at camp right now. And I can't imagine what these parents are going through tonight. Little girls like this. Take a look. Blair and Brooke Harbor, 2 sisters found together, holding hands, dead in the wreckage. They're never going home tonight, and we are praying for them right now. Camp Mystic opened its doors 99 years ago, but all of that is gone now after the Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in a little under an hour. The river, ironically named after Saint Guadalupe, who is the patron saint of protection, guidance, and healing. And we hope that she is with these families tonight. Healing doesn't even begin to describe what they're going to need moving forward, something our first American Pope talked about yesterday.
I would like to express sincere condolences to all the families who have lost loved ones, in particular their daughters who were at summer camp in the disaster caused by the flooding of the Guadalupe River in Texas in the United States. We pray for them.
You never imagine that something like this is even possible, certainly not when you're dropping your kids off at camp all weekend long. My first impulse as a father, as a parent, and you know what I'm talking about, I hope you do, but my first impulse was to blame this camp for not doing everything possible to keep these kids safe. And I'm so tired of hearing that this is a once-in-a-century flood. Everything's always a once-in-a-century whatever it is. Once-in-a-century wildfires, once-in-a-century hurricane, once-in-a-century blizzard. Not everything is once in a century. Sometimes things happen more than once in a century. In fact, it's happened on this river multiple times. Most recently, 1987, in July, the same river flooded in almost the same area, and 10 teenagers were killed, meaning these floods happen at this river. Not every year, but more than once in a century. Why weren't there sirens? Why weren't they better prepared? Did this camp really do enough to keep these little girls safe? We think these are all fair questions that should be asked, and they should be asked tonight when the world is paying attention. But right on cue, the legacy media immediately started to blame this once-in-a-century flooding at 4 in the morning in the Texas Hill Country that happened on a holiday on Donald Trump. The New York Times writing that as floods hit, key roles were vacant at Weather Service offices in Texas. Some experts say staff shortages might have complicated forecasters' ability to coordinate responses with local emergency management officials, something Ted Cruz tried his best to address today.
In the wake of every tragedy, there are things that are predictable. One of the things that's predictable is that you see some people engaging in, I think, partisan games and trying to blame their political opponents for a natural disaster. And you see that with a hurricane, with a tornado, with a wildfire, with this flooding, where people immediately say, well, the hurricane is Donald Trump's fault. Look, that I think most normal Americans know that's ridiculous. And I think this is not a time for partisan finger pointing and attacks.
No, we think so, too. We also heard from the Texas Emergency Division chief, who pointed out very plainly that the original forecast from the National Weather Service was not only wrong, but that it was also grossly inaccurate that night, that there was essentially no way to prepare in advance for what happened.
The original forecast that we received on Wednesday from the National Weather Service predicted 3 to 6 inches of rain in the Concho Valley and 4 to 8 inches of rain in the Hill Country. Everybody got the forecast from the National Weather Service, right? You all got it. You're all in media. You got that forecast. It did not predict the amount of rain that we saw.
So following those comments from somebody that we believe to be an honest broker, a CNN reporter, again, and this was right on cue, tweeted that the question we have to ask is whether any ability to notify or warn was impacted by DOJ cuts on the National Weather Service. I don't know the answer, and we can't assume it. The camp may have been isolated, but I'd want to know if I were a parent. Her name, Juliet Kayyem, and Juliet, I would love to know too, and I am a parent. But by tweeting that, you are essentially stating that DOJ cuts caused this river to flood on Friday morning, which is just not true.
That's Rob Finnerty, who went on to talk about some in the media immediately pointing a finger at the president and DOJ cuts, and then presented some of the facts.
We also know the National Weather Service issued its first flash flood warning at 1:14 a.m. that night. That is not in dispute. Almost 3 hours before the worst of the flooding would occur. 3 full hours. The report also making it clear that there were offices that were totally staffed, even though it was a holiday, on Thursday night, with extra staff on duty. Quote, the National Weather Service, which delivers forecasts for Austin, San Antonio, and the surrounding areas, had extra staff on duty during the storms. The office would typically have 2 forecasters on duty during clear weather, but they had up to 5 that night, meaning this was not a staffing issue, meaning this did not happen because of DOJ cuts. The Texas Tribune also reporting that emergency push notifications were sent at least 9 times to cell phones in the area of that camp after the first flash flood warning was issued. The alert calling the situation extremely dangerous and life-threatening. Granted, everybody was probably asleep, and there weren't any sirens, and that was a problem. Not a single operating siren warning system along this river, the Guadalupe River, which is a river that we just established has flooded in the past and can flood. But if you've ever been to the Midwest, I lived in Kansas City for years, they have tornado sirens that they are required by law to test on a weekly basis, and this is what that sounds like. So would that be enough to wake people up at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, or at 1:14 a.m. when that first weather alert was issued? We will have no way of knowing the answer to that question. But we do think it's safe to assume that if something like that started blaring at 1:14 a.m. when the first weather alert was issued, it would have given people up to 3 hours to get to safety. Those little girls at that camp would have had up to 3 hours to get away from the water. The other part of this story that you're not hearing a lot about tonight are the intangibles, and there are always intangibles, and there were a lot. This happened in a really rural part of Texas where cell phone service is spotty, even on a good day. This happened during a holiday weekend, not only a holiday, but the 4th of July, when people can be out late or are out of town altogether. And this storm developed in less than 2 hours, between 3 and 5 a.m. Would sirens have made a difference? We have no way of knowing the answer to that, but they wouldn't have hurt.
Rob Finnerty is the host of Finnerty, 8 p.m. Eastern on Newsmax. So Rob mentioned the river has had flooding issues in the past, and it turns out that Kerr County officials have been discussing an improved flood warning system and even flood warning sirens for the past 10 years or so. They have publicly discussed what they called inadequate infrastructure. Texas Congressman Chip Roy, whose district includes most of the impacted areas, spoke with our Rob Schmidt.
It was the perfect storm, getting 10 to 12 inches dumped right there in that one spot, sitting there in that tropical storm format, and that happening at 4 to 6 a.m. on a holiday. And so we're going to have to look at all this and look at alert systems and all the warning systems stuff going forward. But right now, I'm just so proud of the people that have showed up to go deal with all of this, to be there for the families, to save lives, to give one's life to save lives, and to lose one's life. It's the ultimate sacrifice.
I mean, some of the stories of heroism, as sad as the stories are of who was lost, and some of the listen to some of the fathers that we've played, it's just been horrible. But the stories of heroism have been impressive as well. Anybody that you know personally affected by this? You know a lot of people in that district.
Yeah, many people that I know. I'm from across the country, but people here. I mean, I've got a friend of mine that worked with me in Senator Cruz's office. Her daughter, she was able to go recover. She was there, a young girl, but her best friend was lost. Another acquaintance who went to law school at the University of Texas, where I went, friend of a friend, he just lost 2 daughters. I could go down the list of people affected. One of my law school classmates, who hadn't seen in a long time, I saw in Kerrville picking up his daughter from another camp. So there's been stories of success, stories of failure, stories of heartbreak. I've got lots of friends and family that are affected by it and have lost people. But again, the stories like Dick Eastland, who lost his life trying to save several of those girls who owned Camp Mystic, who's known as the grandfather who would teach them how to fly fish. He was just, beloved. But then there was the story of Jane Ragsdale, and she gave her life, but I think she saved 4 or 5 kids in the process, active in a church, in the Presbyterian church there in Kerrville. So many stories like that. The Coast Guard volunteer, the Coast Guard pilot, I think, who saved something like 200 people by his actions. So a lot of great stories out of it, a lot of sad stories. I met with some of the families night before last who couldn't find their daughters, and that was one of the toughest meetings I've ever been a part of. But, a lot of strong people, a lot of faith. Last point, those girls that left Camp Mystic, I don't know if you've seen the videos, where they're singing hymns while they leave the camp, and they're watching the devastation, yet they're still singing their hymns, giving honor to God and glory to God. It just tells you why these camps are so important and why we need to make sure we can get them back in operation, but just make sure they're safe in the future.
This story was so immediately politicized, and not just by Democrats, but by very mainstream media like ABC News, Stephanopoulos on Sunday morning, immediately jumping to try and figure a way to tether this to the presidency and to make it a negative story for him. As far as you have seen from what you've looked into, and I know it's early, is there any indication at all that there is an ounce of truth to the idea that some of the funding cuts could have made this situation worse?
Yeah, point number one, I've been focusing on the people and the tragedy and not trying to politicize it and not looking ahead. There'll be time to figure out what worked, what went wrong. But point number two, I have been looking into it, at least briefly, and the idea that these cuts had any impact. First of all, the cuts were heavily to a bunch of the woke garbage and a bunch of the climate change garbage that they have under NOAA. But importantly, they had multiple people who were present in New Braunfels, Texas, which is where they operate out of. They had more staff present. And so, and the idea that many of the cuts wouldn't even take place till fiscal year 26 anyway. So that's all made up. That's nonsense. Yeah. Now, whatever issues there are, whatever weaknesses there are between federal, state, and local, those would have been long since in place, right, under Democrat and Republican administrations, under Republican and Democrat leadership, local leadership and state. We will go through and look at what could be done better. But ultimately, when you have that much water dumped on basically limestone with a little bit of soil after a drought, in a condition like that, in that particular part of the world, you're going to get this rise of water, and it's a relatively unprecedented spike in water in a short period of time in the middle of the night. Yeah. We need to figure out how to do better, but this political finger pointing is nonsense. And we need to just focus on solving the problem going forward, rebuild, and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Texas Congressman Chip Roy on Rob Schmitt tonight. There is more news from Texas, including Border Patrol agents shooting and killing a gunman at a U.S. Border Patrol station in McAllen, Texas, southwest Texas. This happened yesterday, forcing a temporary shutdown at the nearby McAllen airport. Police say a 27-year-old man from Michigan arrived just before 6 a.m. and opened fire on the Customs and Border Protection building. One agent was shot in the leg. The FBI now trying to understand the relevance of a Latin word that was spray painted on the suspect's vehicle as they tried to determine the motive for the shooting and learn more about the suspect. This is Newsmax White House correspondent Mike Carter in yesterday's White House press briefing.
Michael in the back.
Thank you, Caroline. An armed shooter today was shot in McAllen, Texas, after opening fire on Border Patrol agents. It comes just days after Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal recently said she gets, quote, inspired when activists obstruct ICE. Does the White House expect Democrats to tone down their rhetoric in light of what we saw today in McAllen, Texas?
We certainly call on Democrats to tone down their rhetoric against ICE and Border Patrol agents who, again, are everyday men and women. I would encourage AOC and other Democrats to actually meet with the United States Border Patrol. These are honorable Americans who are just simply trying to do their job to enforce the law. They go home to their families every night just like we all do, and they deserve respect and dignity for trying to enforce our nation's immigration laws and to remove public safety threats from our communities. The White House is aware of the shooting that took place today in Texas, and we are working with the appropriate federal agencies to get to the bottom of what happened.
So on yesterday's Newsmax Daily, I said there were going to be a lot of questions about the news from the FBI and DOJ concerning the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. And Mike Carter came through for us.
Caroline, the DOJ and FBI have now concluded there was no Jeffrey Epstein client list. What do you tell MAGA supporters who say they want anyone involved in Jeffrey Epstein's alleged crimes to be held accountable?
This administration wants anyone who has ever committed a crime to be held accountable, and I would argue this administration has done more to lock up bad guys than certainly the previous administration. And the Trump administration is committed to truth and to transparency. That's why the Attorney General and the FBI Director pledged at the President's direction to do an exhaustive review of all of the files related to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and his death. And they put out a memo in conclusion of that review. There was material they did not release because, frankly, it was incredibly graphic and it contained child pornography, which is not something that's appropriate for public consumption. But they committed to an exhaustive investigation. That's what they did, and they provided the results of that. That's transparency.
Follow up on that,
Sure.
Caroline. Okay, so the FBI looks at the circumstances surrounding the death of Jeffrey Epstein. According to the report, this systematic review revealed no incriminating client list. So what happened to the Epstein client list that the Attorney General said she had on her desk?
Well, I think if you go back and look at what the Attorney General said in that interview, which was on your network on Fox News.
Got the quote.
Go ahead.
John Roberts said, DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen? And she said, it's sitting on my desk right now to review.
Yes, she was saying the entirety of all of the paperwork, all of the paper in relation to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. That's what the Attorney General was referring to, and I'll let her speak for that. But again, when it comes to the FBI and the Department of Justice, they are more than committed to ensuring that bad people are put behind bars. They have an operation going on right now called Summer Heat, which has our murder rate trending in the lowest direction in United States history. Their emphasis on violent crime and locking up violent criminals has led to the arrest of 14,000 violent criminals. That's a 62% increase from the same time period last year. So this Attorney General and the FBI Director are committed to putting bad people behind bars where they belong. They promised an exhaustive review. That's what they did. For any further details, I would refer you to the Department of Justice.
So there you go. Thank you to our Michael Carter and Fox's Peter Ducey. I do not like it. I don't like it at all. I need a much deeper and informative explanation from Attorney General Pam Bondi, who sounded an awful lot like she knew an awful lot more than she sounds like she knows now. And we definitely need to hear from FBI Director Patel as well. You know, if it doesn't exist, right, a list, if it just doesn't exist, well, then it doesn't exist. But there is no way Ghislaine Maxwell doesn't have some sort of a list, a little black book, something. She's serving a 20-year prison sentence. And now that Epstein is dead, I'm sure someone in the U.S. government can squeeze something out of her in return for a reduced sentence. And even after last week's Supreme Court ruling, a judge on Monday temporarily barred the Trump administration from revoking Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood, partially freezing a provision of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act only days after the president signed it into law. Let's go to this morning's Wake Up America.
Senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. So walk me through what's going on here.
I wish I knew on what grounds, but I have to get to the end of the story.
Okay.
The end of the story is that she will be summarily reversed today by the judge by the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. This a federal judge in Boston, without hearing from the government, without giving the government even an opportunity to file documents, entered an order restraining Bobby Kennedy and the Department of Health and Human Services from the cutbacks ordered by Congress, and she didn't give any reasons for it. So she clearly will be reversed by the appellate court. She didn't even state any reasons why she was doing it. It's really a head scratcher. Now, the legislation the president signed on the 4th of July does not mention Planned Parenthood by name.
Okay.
But it does prohibit the Department of Health and Human Services from funding any organizations, even if they provide services to the poor for sexual-related matters, if they also pay for abortions. That is for Congress to decide.
Right.
That is not for a federal judge to decide. Under the Constitution, Congress decides how to spend the money. If Congress orders money spent and the president doesn't want to spend it, there's a role for the judiciary telling the president he's got to spend it. But if Congress says we're not going to spend this money, there is no role for the judiciary to tell Congress they have to spend it anyway.
So then what's this judge doing?
Well, she didn't give a reason. There was no hearing. And I read her order 3 times this morning. It's only a page and a half long. It doesn't give reasons. That's another reason why she'll be reversed.
Okay.
Because federal judges are required to give reasons. Why do they have to give reasons? Because the litigants need to know why the end result was achieved, and the appellate court needs to know how the judge got there so they can decide whether or not to affirm or reverse her. This is a true head-scratcher. I will say this. This is a respected judge whom I know and with whom I've had experience. It's a head-scratcher that she did this. At least give the government the opportunity to be heard, and at least give the reasons why you're doing it. None of that happened.
So it just seems standard now that judges can block anything or attempt to block anything. We're just seeing this every single day, it seems like.
That's a good question, Charlotte, and I'm glad you asked it. If a judge finds that something Congress enacted or something the president wants to do arguably violates a liberty protected by the Constitution, let's say free speech, or let's say due process, the right to a trial before the government wants to take your life, your liberty, or your property. It is the duty of the judges to intercede. But if a judge disagrees on a policy matter or doesn't think Congress should have done this, there is no role for the judiciary. I almost always defend the judiciary, as you know, having been there. But here, there is no role for the judiciary. And as I said, it's a head-scratcher as to why she did this.
Do you feel like the last 6 months since Donald Trump has been in office, that's what we're seeing a lot of? You said the phrase disagrees with a policy matter. Is that what could be happening here?
I think that's what's happening here. In many of the other judicial decisions, most of which made their way to the Supreme Court, the judges were able to find a statute that the president didn't follow or a provision of the Constitution that he chose to ignore. Here, there is nothing pinpointed by this judge as to what Congress did that violated the Constitution. Congress whether we like it or not, can spend money on anything it wants and can refuse to spend money on anything it wants. That's been the law of the land since the FDR administration and the New Deal era.
Newsmax chief judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano on Wake Up America with Charla McBride. The judge in question here is U.S. District Judge Indira, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, Indira Talawani, who was appointed by President Obama. After officially being nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, today President Trump is holding another cabinet meeting at the White House. And if you're flying today, good news. After nearly 20 years, the TSA is now allowing people to keep their shoes on at security checkpoints. This was all because of one moron who wanted to be a terrorist named Richard Reed, who attempted and failed, thankfully, at blowing up a plane with a makeshift bomb in his shoe. If you trigger an alarm at the TSA checkpoint, then you will still be required to take your shoes off. If you have TSA pre-check, then you know that this has already been the policy. And today is National Video Game Day. So if you're a gamer like my son Nicholas, well, today you have a good excuse to play your video games. On Wall Street, stocks opened mixed this morning. The S&P and the Nasdaq slightly higher. The Dow was slightly lower after losing more than 400 points yesterday on President Trump's tariff announcements.
So the reciprocal tariff rate, or these new rates that will be provided in this correspondence to these foreign leaders, will be going out the door within the next month, or deals will be made.
And according to Yahoo Finance this morning, South Korea is already talking about making a deal with the U.S. Tesla stock, which lost 7% yesterday, is bouncing back a bit this morning as founder and CEO Elon Musk pushes for a new political party in America, which investors don't seem to like. Bitcoin and most other major cryptocurrencies are higher. Bitcoin is up a little more than $700, pushing 109,000. XRP is still at $2.29. If you didn't hear me yesterday, crypto people, when is the XRP explosion going to happen? All right, be sure to keep up with all of today's news and breaking developments. There will be plenty of them throughout the day on Newsmax, N2, and at Newsmax.com. Also, make sure you have the Newsmax app on your phone so you can stay up to date and informed anywhere, anytime. The news starts each and every morning with Wake Up America, followed by National Report, Finnerty at 8, Greg Kelly, and much, much more. All with expert analysis from people like Judge Andrew Napolitano, Senator Rick Santorum, foreign policy expert Fred Fleitz, Professor Dershowitz, and many, many others. I'm Tony Marino. Thank you, as always, for the download. Pay attention and keep on fighting the good fight.
News breaks every minute, every day. You need the app, the Newsmax app. Find it free on your smartphone store. Then watch us anytime, anywhere.
Information. Truth. Is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.